If you've ever searched for Applied Energistics guides, you've probably seen builds like this. Huge controllers, dozens of dense cables, hundreds of P2P tunnels. Sometimes the network takes up more space than the base itself. And it's usually explained the same way. If you want a large AE2 network, sooner or later you'll have to build something like this. Before I explain why I think it's wrong, it's probably fair to explain where this opinion comes from. I've completed GTNH 2 times and I'm finishing my third run right now. And I also took a part in a world record speedrun of it. Over those playthroughs, my AE2 networks have used more than 30,000 channels combined. You would expect someone with that history to show you how to build an even bigger controller, but instead I've almost stopped using them at all. Before we get into it, I also want to mention that there is already a great video on this topic by Bucket called "You don't need 21,504 channels." His point is that most players will never actually build a base big enough to need a network this size. And he's right about that. But watching it left me with a different question, one that his video doesn't really get into. Even if you did need a base that large, why does it end up needing that many channels in the first place? And that's the question we are answering today. Before we talk about fixing large AE2 networks, we first need to understand why channels became a problem in the first place. Even if you've been using Applied Energistics for years, stick around for the next couple of minutes. Everything else in this video builds on this idea. The easiest way to think about an AE2 network is a transportation system. Imagine you own a giant distribution center. All of your factories, machines and storage systems want to exchange resources with each other, but they can't just teleport items around. They need trucks moving between the distribution center and the factories. In AE2, those trucks are your channels. One important thing to understand is that the channel isn't the item itself. A truck can carry 1 iron ingot or it can carry 2 million iron ingots. From the network's perspective, that's still one truck making one trip. Channels are simply the paths that allow communication between different parts of the network. Those trucks have to come from somewhere, and that's exactly what the controller does. You can think of it as a central truck depot. Every side of the controller can dispatch up to 32 trucks. Now we need the roads to get those trucks where they need to go. A dense cable is simply a highway. It has enough lanes for all 32 trucks to drive through at once. A normal cable is a much smaller road, with room for only 8. And here's a question worth asking before I answer it. What happens if the trucks leave the depot on a small 8-lane road and 100 meters later that road turns into a huge 32-lane highway? Does that suddenly create 24 extra trucks? Of course not. The highway is capable of carrying 32 trucks, but only 8 ever reached it in the first place. Which explains one of the most common mistakes beginners make, putting a dense cable after a normal cable and expecting it to unlock the full 32 channels. It doesn't, and now you know exactly why. So if that's all a channel is, just one truck reaching one destination, why do people end up building controllers capable of running 21,000 of them? The thing is, your base starts with a single factory, maybe a no processing line, and it needs a handful of machines, a couple of interfaces, some input buses, maybe a few level emitters, and nothing crazy. Then you build a wire mill setup and connect it to the same network. Later you add an extruder line, then benders, chemical reactors, circuit assemblers, and every time you need to build something new, the easiest thing to do is connect it to the network you already have. That's where the problem quietly begins, not because any individual factory uses that many channels, but because every factory is sharing the same network. By the time you reach late game GTNH, that single network isn't serving one production line anymore, it's serving your entire base. Notice what actually caused that though. It wasn't that the base got big, it's that every new factory defaulted to joining the one network that already existed. Which raises a question worth sitting with for a second. Does that connection actually need to exist? Think about your own base for a second. Does your wire mill really care about how your chemical reactor works? Does your bending machine need to know anything about your ore processing line? Not really. The only reason they are connected is that eventually they all need to exchange items with your main storage. The independent factory is forced to live inside the same network simply because that's how most people build AE2 systems. Once you look at it this way, a different question starts to appear. Instead of asking, how do I fit more channels into my main network? What if you ask something else entirely? Why is your factory using my main base at all? So if one giant networks create all of these problems, what if you just stopped building one giant network? That's where subnetworks come in. Remember the truck depot from earlier? Instead of one giant depot serving the whole base, imagine every factory getting its own local depot instead. A lot of people think subnetworks are just another AE2 trick to save channels, and I don't think that's what makes them powerful. I think they are powerful because they let each factory become its own self-contained system. In my base, for example, my wire mills have their own controller, my extruders have their own controller, my benders have their own controller. Every major production line I build gets its own AE2 network, with its own channels, its own storage and its own automation. They don't need to know the rest of the base exists. The main networks has a completely different job. It isn't responsible for running every single machine anymore. It's simply responsible for coordinating the factories. It tells them what needs to be crafted, receives finished products and keeps tracks of storage. And that's about it. This completely changes how channels scale. Say every one of these factories uses 1,000 channels internally. And sounds like a lot, right? 5 factories would already need 5,000 channels, 20 factories 20,000. That's exactly the point where people usually start building gigantic controllers full of P2P tunnels, because a controller can only push 32 channels per side, and stacking enough sites and tunnels to move 20,000 through one point becomes its own project. But in my case, the main network never has to move 20,000 channels through one point, because it never sees those channels at all. Every factory spends its channels inside its own network, on its own controller. The connection back to the main network isn't 20,000 channels, it's just one link per factory, the same way a single interface only ever needs one channel no matter how much it's moving behind it. So instead of building one network capable of carrying 20,000 channels, I built 20 independent networks with 1,000 channels each, and the main network only ever has to carry 20 connections, not 20,000. If you add up every channel used across my base, the number will be enormous. It would completely fill those 21,504 channel controllers. But that's the wrong way to count them. Those channels don't belong to one network anymore. There is a practical benefit here too, beyond channel counts. Expansion becomes trivial. In a traditional network, adding a new production line means finding spare channels, finding space on your controller, routing more P2P tunnels, figuring out where everything fits. But in my base, I built another subnetwork connected to the main network and I'm done. I don't even need to think about how many channels my controller has left, because that problem was solved months ago. At this point, you might think all of this is just about channels. It isn't, because this same architecture changes something much more important: performance. Before explaining this, I want to make one thing clear. Channels themselves aren't expensive. You can disable channels entirely in the AE2 config, connect 10,000 machines together, and the channels themselves won't suddenly start lagging your world. That's not where the cost comes from. The expensive part is when items actually enter or leave the storage system. Every time an item enters your storage network, AE2 has to decide where that item belongs. Which drives it should go into, does that drive already contain this item, is there enough space left, should it be using a different storage cell instead. None of those questions are individually expensive. The problem is that they happen over and over again. Picture a warehouse where every few seconds a small delivery van comes with 2 boxes. A worker has to stop, look around, decide where those boxes belong, and put them away. A few seconds later another van arrives, then another, hundreds of tiny deliveries, each one requiring its own decision. Now picture something different. Instead of hundreds of tiny deliveries, a single truck arrives once a week with 1,000,000 boxes inside. The worker opens the truck, sees that one section of the warehouse is empty and says, "Unload everything there." One decisions and 1,000,000 boxes, which is much cheaper than making the same decisions hundreds of thousands of times. That's essentially what subnetworks are doing. Instead of every machine constantly talking to the main storage system, an entire factory works locally, storing its own intermediate products, moving items between its own machines, buffering everything internally, and only exposing items to the main network when it actually needs to communicate with the rest of the base. Suddenly, the main network isn't dealing with hundreds of tiny operations coming from every machine. It's dealing with much smaller number of much larger exchanges. And this isn't just theory. During the GTNH speedrun, we ran into exactly this problem. At one point, we had around 200 DTPFs running simultaneously. Everything worked, but server performance was getting noticeably worse. So we opened LagGoggles to see what was happening. Every single output bus connected directly to the main AE network was taking somewhere around 100 or 250 microseconds. And there were almost 200 of them. So we changed exactly one thing. We didn't remove any machines, didn't slow production down, didn't upgrade the server, we simply rebuilt the output architecture as a subnetwork. Same machines, same true outputs, the same world, but a different architecture. After that change, those output buses disappeared from LagGoggles immediately, meaning each one was taking less than 10 microseconds. The main network wasn't processing every tiny output individually anymore. It was just receiving the finished result. Obviously, this isn't one thing that affects performance. World size matters, other modes matter, server hardware matters, but what this experiment showed clearly is that network architecture matters too, and it's one of the few things you can improve without sacrificing production speed. So what about P2P tunnels? If you reached this far, you might have noticed I haven't shown a single P2P setup. And that's because I don't use them, at least not for carrying channels. Now, don't get me wrong, P2P tunnels are a brilliant piece of engineering, and there are absolutely situations where they make sense, but I think a lot of players end up using them to solve a problem they accidentally created themselves. Think about what actually happens. Your main network starts running out of channels, so you build a bigger controller. Then you start routing P2P tunnels. Before long, you're spending hours expanding the infrastructure that's supposed to support your factories instead of actually building new factories. The irony is that most of these channels were never needed in the main network to begin with. They belonged inside the factories. That's why I stopped thinking about channels as something to maximize. Instead, I try to minimize how many channels the main network actually needs. Every time I build a new production line, I don't ask how do I connect this to my controller. I ask, can this be its own network? Most of the time the answer is yes. Each of my subnetworks might be using hundreds, sometimes thousands of channels internally. If I added all of them together, the total would easily exceed one of those massive 21,000 channel controllers. But that's the point. They don't add together anymore, they're independent. That's why my main controller stays surprisingly small. It's not because my base is small and not because I'm using fewer machines, but because the main network no longer has the job of running the entire factory. It only coordinates it. Looking back, I think this is why so many players end up building networks that large. Not because they misjudge what they need, but because they're trying to scale a single network until it becomes large enough to contain an entire megabase. So, if there is one idea I'd like you to remember from this video, it's this. Don't ask yourself how to build a bigger AE2 network. Ask yourself where it really needs to be one network at all. Because most of the time the answer isn't a bigger controller, it's just another one. Thanks for watching. Bye.